Hi, my name is Neil Ferris, and I'm here again virtually in the Museum of Ontario Archaeology's repository to share with you another story of an archaeological site known from the collections housed here at the museum's repository. I'm going to again point you to the holdings that the museum has that are displayed on the Google Arts and Culture page for the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. And this time I'm specifically going to point out three rather prosaic artifacts of day-to-day life: a bead, a thimble, and a glass and brass pendant. These three artifacts come from a site in South Brantford in southern Ontario along the Grand River. Today, if you were to go by the location where these artifacts came from, you would see a very pleasant landscape area, most notable for the presence of Mohawk Chapel, a significant historic piece of architecture, grounds, and cemetery. First built in 1795, the chapel was a gift from the British Crown at the time to the Six Nations and Mohawk Nation in particular. And this chapel has remained over that period of time and is reportedly the oldest church in Ontario, still standing today. It has a number of plaques, memorials to famous people from the Mohawk Nation, including Pauline Johnson and Joseph Brant. A plaque that I want to draw your attention to, located just outside the front of the main entrance to the chapel, is this one here, and notably that it was dedicated and unveiled on October 1st, 1984 by Queen Elizabeth II. Now, this is important for my story here today because in October of 1984, the Queen visited Canada and specifically several places in Ontario to celebrate the bicentennial that Ontario had declared 1984 to be, as a result of many loyalists coming north at the conclusion of the American War of Independence. Specifically, she came to Brantford to visit Mohawk Chapel, and it was a big occasion. Many dignitaries, such as Premier Bill Davis and Chief Wellington Stats from Six Nations, were there to greet her, and there was much celebration of this 200th anniversary of Mohawk Chapel in particular, and the connection between the Crown and the Six Nations people. Now, at that location, there was a lot of work being done in the early 1980s to prepare for this visit, which lasted less than an hour, but included extensive renovations to Mohawk Chapel and the grounds around Mohawk Chapel, and also extensive work by the Grand River Conservation Authority at the time to develop some construction to prevent flooding along the Grand River in Brantford, which was quite a chronic issue at that time. That meant that the area around Mohawk Chapel included some pathways and dikes that were built, along with a large parking lot built next to Mohawk Chapel at that time. And in 1983, in August of 1983, this is what that parking lot adjacent to Mohawk Chapel looked like. And the reason why this is important is because in 1983, I was working for the Ontario government, the Ministry of Culture and Recreation at the time, along with a good friend, colleague, and mentor, Ian Kenyon. And in August, we were asked to attend some of the work being done at Mohawk Chapel, especially work around the footing of the chapel on the outside, because there's a cemetery immediately surrounding Mohawk Chapel. And prior to the 20th century, putting your grave as close as possible to the church was an important thing people tried to do. So there was concerns that there would be, in fact, burials encountered there. And as we were driving to Mohawk Chapel, we drove by this construction, and Ian in particular got very excited because he knew that the stripping that you see in this photograph was impacting an area that was the heart of, or part of the heart of Mohawk Village, which was the community around Mohawk Chapel that was established in 1784. Now, Mohawk Village was one of several villages established along the Grand River in 1784 as nations of people, communities of the Six Nations Confederacy, relocated from New York State to Ontario at the conclusion of the American Revolution. And Mohawk Village was really the most northerly of these settlements at the time, and established on a large bend on the Grand River. This village was quite important. It was located on a prominent ridge along the Grand River. It became an important stop along the overland transportation route between York or Toronto and Windsor. It was the home of Joseph Brant through the latter part of the 18th century. Joseph Brant was a very prominent and important figure in Mohawk history during this time. And as a result of Mohawk Village, its location, and its association with Joseph Brant, this community also became very much the face of the Six Nations Confederacy in its interactions with colonial historical figures of the time, including John Gray Simcoe and a number of other famous historical personalities of the day. And it was also important because Joseph Brant in particular sought to advance Six Nations role in the shaping of what was then the early era of the emergent colonialism, British colonialism that was occurring across southern Ontario. Mohawk Village was noted as a cluster of houses, the chapel built in 1785, Joseph Brant's two-story frame house to one side, and even a council house during the late 18th century, as depicted here in this watercolor by Elizabeth Simcoe. Now, over the next half century or so, especially after the War of 1812, non-Indigenous settlement along the Grand River continually encroached on Six Nations communities, and by about the mid-19th century or a little earlier, the 1840s, many people relocated from those locations onto what would become Ohsweken in the Six Nations Reserve we know today. Mohawk Village continued into the mid 19th century, but fewer and fewer families lived there. I believe by the mid-19th century, by the 1850s, only 3 families lived in Mohawk Village, and including members of the Powless family, who had originally settled along with the Brants at Mohawk Village in the 18th century and were a prominent family in this community, and continue to be a prominent family in the Six Nations today. And their plot was located to the east of Mohawk Chapel. And in 1851-52, the census indicates that Peter Paulus lived in that house along with his wife Elizabeth, and we believe that this painting from 1853-54 actually depicts the Paulus household. By 1861, Elizabeth was living in the house by herself. She had been widowed by that time. She was living with Mary and Johann Paulus, along with a woman from Tuscarora who presumably was helping her. Also in the census records, it looks like the Pauluses were boarding young women who were identified in the census as non-residents. And by the later 1860s, I believe we understand, as best we understand, Elizabeth at that time moved away from Mohawk Village to Ohsweken, where she lived out the rest of her life. She died in 1877 and was buried at Mohawk Chapel, and her headstone it still can be found there today. So a long history of Mohawk Village at that time, and it was this rich history and important early history for Ontario that was running through Ian's mind as we drove by and saw that construction. The reason why it was important for Ian is that he and his father, Thomas Kenyon, or Tim Kenyon, had done a lot of archaeological work there, along with another archaeologist, David Fox, and had documented many localities that made up Mohawk Village over their years of walking fields in this area. And one of those areas in particular was where this grading had occurred, what Ian and Tim had referred to as Site A, and historical research suggests was indeed the Peter and Elizabeth Paulus homestead. So we came across this construction. We weren't there to do the archaeology related to this construction. In fact, we were unaware of this construction occurring at the time, because in the early 80s, archaeological conservation was not often accounted for in a lot of different construction activities, including things like landscaping and water management. So there was a conversation with Wellington Stats, the chief of Six Nations, Tom Hill, the director of the Woodland Cultural Center, and the Grand River Conservation Authority. And we managed to get 2 weeks to excavate what we could at this location to document what had been uncovered by this stripping. Now, this area of stripping, we examined and immediately noticed that there were actually two clusters of features associated with Mohawk Village, and both of them included cellar depressions. And cellars were typically below ground holes, usually dug or sometimes dug underneath the cabin or house itself, and they acted as cold storage for the house. And of course, when the house was abandoned, these holes were filled in and became important archaeological contexts for understanding the life of the people who lived above those cellars through the duration of those sites. So we knew that there were two cellars and clusters of features along with those cellars. We had 2 weeks to excavate these cellars, so we had to marshal volunteers, and we did. We managed to marshal 43 volunteers over really 13 days of excavation. There was one day when it was just too heavy rain. And these volunteers included Tom Hill and Chief Stats themselves, along with a wide range of avocational and professional archaeologists, residents who lived in the area, as well as community members, all interested in seeing what could be uncovered in this location. It's really that effort that led to us being able to know what we do know about this little corner of Mohawk Village during its life between the end of the 18th century and the 1860s. The excavations themselves revealed a range of features around these two keyhole-shaped cellar-like features, which you can see depicted in this site map. You can see the profiles for those two cellars, and they are pretty typical. There's a keyhole shape or a little tang sticking off to one side, and that's typically where the entrance is cut into the cellar. And the two cellars appear to be sequential in time. The material of the features to the left and the one cellar dated from about 1800 or so to the 1830s, and the cellar to the right and features around that appear to represent an occupation from the 1830s to the 1860s. We believe from all historical references that both of these relate to the Powis family, and both likely relate to Peter and Elizabeth, if not other members of the Powis family before Peter and Elizabeth lived on their own. The findings from the site were quite significant and quite abundant and reflective of early 19th century material culture. This included a wide range of fine ceramics, spanning the entire period of time. So the chronology is very important because we can compare the early and the later cellar to look at changes in material culture patterning through the time. You'll see on this image some shards from a series of transfer printed plates depicting the Kirby Hotel, which was a mid-19th century hotel from Brantford that depicted pastoral scenes of indigenous lifeways and were clearly items of nostalgia and relevance to the Powis family residents. In addition, there was extensive numbers of white clay smoking pipes. These are quite common in 19th century sites. They're basically what people used before the invention of cigarettes. They are made of a thin white clay that really only lasts a few smokes. So you would buy them like 144 gross for a penny. So they were quite disposable, and therefore they're quite common on these sites. But interestingly, in the later cellar was also found a 16th century indigenous pipe. The Grand River is known as a very rich archaeological locale, and clearly someone residing in that house at some point collected a few artifacts from the area. We don't know where this pipe comes from, but clearly they recognized it as an artifact to keep. Also found on both sites were extensive numbers of beads and also a number of goods related to clearly indigenous exchanges and annual gift distributions from the British Crown. Shell beads of wampum were found in the earlier cellar, silver. But in the later cellar, it was more mid-Victorian jewelry that was found, but there was a lot of beads, a lot of these embroidery beads from soil flotations are very, very small, many, many buttons, thimbles, needles, and indeed, the quantity is remarkable even in comparison to the earlier cellar. So the assumption is that Elizabeth Powless or some of the non-resident girls who were living in that house in the mid-19th century perhaps were working on the adjacent Mohawk Institute, the school that is notorious now, but at the time was just established, and the earlier version of the Mohawk Institute was right across the street from the Powell's property, and some of these girls may have been making cottage industry crafts, such as embroidery and beadwork items, which might explain why there's so many of these otherwise prosaic household items in the cellar. Importantly, the lifestyle of the Powless family through this period of time reflects their own sense of who they were and how they fit in the world that they were a part of. And a lot of this we can see from simple day-to-day living. Nowhere more does this shine than in dining patterns and the various dimensions of food choices and cutlery and plates and all the dining conventions of personal and formal dining. And we can see this in the range of material culture from the site just by simply looking at differences between the two cellars and differences between larger plates, smaller plates, and teas, cups, and saucers. Smaller plates and teas tended to be associated more with single serving and formal presentation of dining. The larger dinner plates seem to be more related to personal, daily dining, and there's variations in both the frequencies of these in the assemblages between the early and the late sites, and in the emphasis on what would be expensive wares, considered expensive wares at the time, and notably the smaller plates were almost all expensive in the later cellar, mostly so in the earlier cellar, less so for the larger plates. And this suggests some notions of engaging with dining conventions of the time. But of course, at the same time, these people are also living and making choices that are related to who they are and their heritage and their identity as prominent Mohawk families through that time. And also, it's important to keep in mind that probably the person who's stocking the china cupboard through much of this period is Elizabeth. So these also reflect her notions of what's important to have, what's important to show, and how to engage with those dining conventions that they were a part of and apart from, because these patterns that we see in the archaeological record of the ceramics in particular are distinct from what we see from adjacent Euro-Canadian archaeological sites during this time, and almost look like an exaggerated use of these material goods to emphasize status and identity, but also set apart from broader European notions of colonial identity. Indeed, much of the history of Mohawk Village that's explored in detail in a number of research projects that have happened since that excavation in 1983 has explored the many ways in which the residents of Mohawk Village both engage with themselves and with the wider emergent colonialism of the time distinctly. and negotiated the materiality of both their Six Nations heritage as well as the popular fashion and cultural trends of the wider British colonial society they were negotiating through that period of time as well too. And this is a legacy that continues into the writing and performances of Pauline Johnson through the end of the 19th century, and really dates back as a strong strategy of cultural distinctiveness and identity that this Mohawk community practiced even before they came to the Grand River in 1784, when they were situated through much of the 18th century in New York, and also negotiating with British colonials through much of that time. There's so much more to tell of this site. It's such a rich and deep part of Ontario's archaeological heritage, and really only one part of a much more diverse and rich heritage of the Six Nations community and their sovereign territory along the Grand River, which continues to both be documented by archaeologists and by members of the Six Nations community today, and continues to reveal a fascinating, rich history that sometimes more generally we're not as aware of as we should be. And for me, this was a formative site and a formative time in my career, because Ian was so influential to who I became as an archaeologist, and his passion for the archaeology of the Grand River, and his dad's passion for the archaeology and history of the Grand River were passions that they were kind enough to pass on to me. So I hope you appreciate or enjoyed or found at least a little bit interesting this brief window into the archaeology, history, and heritage of Mohawk Village. If you're interested in reading more about it, there's been 2 books published on the archaeology of Mohawk Village as part of wider research projects. And there continues to be a rich heritage of the village and the chapel that you could visit when time allows us to do such things again, at the Woodland Center and at Mohawk Chapel itself. And I encourage you to visit these locations and imagine the setting as it was in 1784, when those people, along with Joseph Brant, chose to settle the Mohawk Village in that location, long before Brantford even or Ontario came into being. Anyways, thanks for your time, and I look forward to talking to you again another time. Bye-bye.